Welcome back to RegTalkUK, the podcast that helps UK banking professionals stay sharp, stay informed, and stay ahead of regulation. I'm Alex.
And I'm Jamie.
So a challenger bank, fabricates its capital reports, actively misleads the prudential regulator, and then gets a £12 million fine slashed to just $2 million because, well, they simply can't afford to pay it.
Right. And meanwhile, a shadow lender holding about £1.3 billion of wholesale funding completely collapses into administration just months after the regulator handed it a clean bill of health.
Exactly. Plus, the FCA is ripping up the rule book on investment advice, shifting from gathering quote-unquote necessary information to merely sufficient information.
And at the same time, we're seeing the Treasury hard-coding crisis-era mortgage forbearance into your standard everyday operations. It is a massive week.
It really is. So what connects a regulatory wrist slap for outright fabrication with a massive blind spot that leaves wholesale funders exposed to a billion-pound crater?
Well, if you look closely at the enforcement actions and policy papers crossing our desks this week, you see a very distinct, almost brutal pattern emerging. I'd say we are entering the era of smarter regulation.
Smarter regulation. Okay, define that for the people listening.
It means the regulator is using technology to speed up the front door, but they are ruthlessly policing the living room with outcome-based judgments.
Right. So for those of you sitting in retail banking strategy or risk or compliance, this means the days of hiding behind a 50-page defensive PDF report are completely over.
Spot on. The regulators are demanding absolute candor, but they are also asking you to rewire how you engage with struggling consumers amid some pretty radical economic uncertainty. You just cannot rely on tick box compliance when the underlying economics of your portfolio are fundamentally shifting.
Let's unpack that demand for candor first, because the Prudential Regulation Authority has just set a frightening precedent regarding data integrity. According to the PRA, the Bank of London Group and its parent company, Allplies Holdings, were fined for misleading supervisors and fabricating capital documents.
Yeah, and the details here are genuinely staggering. The PRA levied a £12 million fine, but they applied a massive discount down to $2 million due to financial hardship.
Wow, an 80% discount.
Exactly. The FCA also stepped in and banned them from onboarding new customers. Now, what makes this unprecedented is that this is the PRA's first ever integrity finding under Fundamental Rule 1 against a firm, and crucially, the first against a parent holding company.
We need to look at the mechanics of why a Fundamental Rule 1 breach is so severe, though. Candor with regulators used to be framed as, a soft cultural expectation.
Yeah, a firm might get a slap on the wrist for being slow to report a breach. But a Fundamental Rule 1 finding of a lack of integrity means the regulator believes there was an active, deliberate attempt to deceive.
Which is a huge escalation.
It's massive. Under the senior managers and certification regime, this is a trigger for direct personal liability. If the board-level management information you are signing off on contains fabricated capital metrics, the corporate fine is really just the beginning.
Because the individuals involved face prohibition orders and the total loss of their careers in the city.
Spot on.
But hold on. Look at the optics of this penalty. If a politically connected challenger bank can submit fabricated documents to its prudential supervisor and then plead poverty to get £10 million wiped off its fine, does that punishment actually fit the crime?
It's a fair question.
I mean, it feels like the PRA is saying, well, we caught you lying about your capital, but since you actually don't have any capital, we'll let you off the hook for 80% of the fine. Does this just expose how dangerously thin capital buffers really are in the challenger space?
I think that hardship discount certainly exposes a systemic vulnerability, yes. But it also sends a terrifying message to everyone else. The regulator is basically confirming that they will pursue an enforcement action even if it pushes the firm to the absolute brink of insolvency.
Right. It's not a free pass.
Not at all. And if we connect this to the FCA's new 2026-27 work program, the narrative becomes even clearer. The FCA is championing the use of generative AI to speed up authorizations and reduce what they term compliance friction.
They want a faster front door.
Exactly. But this PRA fine proves the massive catch. If you abuse that faster onboarding by providing false data once you are inside the perimeter, they have absolutely zero tolerance.
So you can't look at this as just an isolated incident for a challenger bank. If you are sitting on a risk committee next week, you need to stress test your own operations against this exact scenario.
Absolutely.
What happens to your funding lines and your liquidity if the FCA suddenly slaps an onboarding restriction on you tomorrow? And from a commercial governance perspective, you have to retest your board-level management information.
especially if you operate within a complex group structure.
Right. The data flowing from the subsidiaries to the holding company cannot just be aggregated. It must be stress tested for absolute bulletproof accuracy.
Yeah, the regulators are clearly adopting a zero-tolerance policy for integrity failures inside the regulatory perimeter. But the glaring contradiction in this deep dive is what happens when 1.3 billion pounds explodes just outside of it.
Oh, this is the market financial solutions collapse.
Yeah.
So MFS, a major bridging lender, has fallen into administration, and it has exposed its wholesale funders to a 1.3 billion pound shortfall.
A staggering amount of money.
It is. And this wasn't just bad market timing. There were serious allegations of double-pledged assets.
Yeah.
Yet just in 2024, an FCA-commissioned law firm review gave MSS a completely clean bill of health.
Yeah.
How does a firm build a billion-pound house of cards right under the nose of a mandated review?
Because of the specific mechanical limitations of their registration, MFS was an Annex 1 firm.
Right, Annex 1. Remind everyone what that means in practice.
So Annex 1 firms are registered with the FCA solely for anti-money laundering purposes. The FCA does not authorize their lending products, they do not set capital adequacy rules for them, and they definitely do not police their day-to-day credit decisions.
So that 2024 review gave them a clean bill of health just because the review is strictly looking at AML compliance.
Exactly. They were essentially checking if the incoming cash was clean, completely ignoring the massive uncollateralized credit risks on the way out.
So let me get this straight. A retail bank provides a massive wholesale funding line to a bridging lender, assuming that the underlying property collateral is solid. But if that bridging lender is double pledging the same property to multiple funders, the retail bank's exposure is suddenly entirely unsecured.
That is the nightmare scenario, yes.
I look at this and have to ask, is the FCA using this perimeter distinction as an excuse to deflect blame? I mean, in their latest perimeter report, they are actively asking Parliament for 15 legislative changes to redraw these boundaries.
They are, yeah.
But the reality on the ground is that consumers and wholesale funders already assume FCA registered means financially sound.
And that assumption is exactly why Annex 1 is such a dangerous systemic blind spot. And it is a blind spot that is actively widening, actually. Look at what the Bank of England just published in Policy Statement 1026.
The resolution thresholds.
Right. They raised the resolution assessment threshold from 50 billion pounds to 100 billion pounds in retail deposits.
Meaning they are intentionally aiming all their heavy prudential artillery at the absolute largest systemic giants.
Yes, and by elevating that threshold, they are inadvertently creating a massive mesh for mid-tier players and shadow banking entities to just slip through. The regulatory net is incredibly wide, but the holes are getting bigger.
So if a regulator focuses all its bandwidth on the top tier, wholesale funders simply cannot rely on the FCA badge as a proxy for counterparty financial health in the mid-tier.
Which means your due diligence framework is currently on trial. If your bank provides wholesale funding to private credit or bridging lenders, you cannot look at an Annex 1 FCA registration and just tick the compliance box.
So next week, you need to audit those wholesale funding exposures straight away. You must drill down into their actual lending standards and, crucially, their collateral management systems.
Are you absolutely certain that the assets securing your funding haven't been pledged to 3 other banks? You need to know that.
It is a fascinating paradox, really. While the FCA is desperately asking Parliament to patch these massive holes in the shadow banking perimeter, they are simultaneously taking a sledgehammer to the regulatory walls in the retail investment space.
Yes, which brings us to Consultation Paper 2610. This fundamentally rewrites the rules on retail advice to close the advice gap. The FCA is merging COBS 9 and 9A into a unified COBS 9C.
Okay, but what's the actual on-the-ground impact of that?
Well, the true earthquake here is the change to the suitability requirement. Previously, advisors had to gather all quote-unquote necessary information about a client. Now, the standard is simply gathering sufficient information.
And they are completely scrapping mandated annual reviews, right? Replacing them with periodic reviews based entirely on client needs.
Exactly. We really cannot overstate how monumental this pivot is for retail banking strategy. For years, the industry has suffered from the PDF graveyard, those 40-page, heavily caveated suitability reports that function purely as a defensive compliance shield rather than an actual aid to the consumer.
Yeah, nobody reads them.
Nobody. By shifting to sufficient information, the regulator is finally allowing banks to offer cheaper, limited scope advice for simple products, like a basic stocks and shares ISA, without undertaking a holistic, incredibly extensive fact find.
Let's ground this in a real-world analogy. Under the old rules, packing for a weekend in Cornwall meant you had to pack snowshoes and a tuxedo just in case. That was the necessary information.
That's a great way to look at it.
Now, the FCA says just pack a raincoat and some wellies. That's the sufficient information. For a decade, compliance departments have forced advisors to pack the snowshoes. Now, the FCA is explicitly saying, stop packing the snowshoes. Just grab the wellies.
Right, but there's a catch.
There's always a catch. I am genuinely stuck on the word sufficient. If I'm a compliance officer, sufficient sounds terrifyingly subjective. How do I prove to the financial ombudsman 5 years from now that the 3 pages of information I gathered were sufficient when the client's investment inevitably loses value?
Well, you have hit on the exact mechanism of the risk there. It is subjective by design, because this is the ultimate real-world test of the consumer duty.
They're forcing us to make a judgment call.
Precisely. The regulator is forcing the industry to abandon prescriptive tick-box rules and instead rely on professional judgment focused on fair value and good consumer outcomes.
But the ombudsman operates on what is fair and reasonable in hindsight. That's the terrifying part.
It is. To defend against that hindsight, your firm has to explicitly document the boundaries of the advice. You have to prove that the advice was suitable for the specific, narrowly defined scope that the consumer agreed to.
So commercially, this is a massive green light. You should be mapping out a new, limited-scope digital advice journey next week. You can finally utilize layered disclosures where a consumer clicks to reveal more risk information if they want it, rather than being forced to scroll through a textbook.
Yes, but the risk mitigation has to be ironclad. You must clearly define what sufficient means for every single one of your simplest products.
And your back-end data must capture not just what information was gathered, but the precise rationale for why the firm deemed it sufficient to proceed. If that rationale isn't logged, you will absolutely lose the FOS claim.
Completely agree.
If you're finding this useful, don't forget to follow RegTalkUK on Spotify or subscribe on YouTube. It really helps us reach more banking professionals like you.
Let's pivot slightly. We've talked about the consumer duty driving changes in retail investments, but let's look at how that same focus on outcomes is colliding with the macroeconomy in the mortgage market.
Right. The Bank of England's chief economist, Hugh Hill, recently warned that we are operating in an environment of radical uncertainty.
And the macro-fiscal data backs that up entirely. The OECD is projecting a higher-for-longer environment with sticky 4% inflation, and this is being compounded by severe energy shocks emanating from the Middle East.
Which brings us to the Chancellor. Against this backdrop, the Chancellor recently summoned the 6 largest lenders to reaffirm the commitments made under the Mortgage Charter.
The mechanics of this are quite daunting for operations teams. Lenders are now required to proactively contact the 1.6 million customers whose fixed-rate mortgage deals are set to expire by the end of 2026.
So you don't wait for them to miss a payment?
No, you have to reach out and offer them options like temporary interest-only payments or extending the term of their mortgage, and you have to do it without leaving a negative mark on their credit scores.
What we are witnessing here is the Treasury essentially hard-coding crisis-era forbearance into the standard, everyday operations of a retail bank. Offering breathing space was viewed as a temporary pandemic-era blip.
Right, but now proactive structured forbearance is the permanent operational baseline.
But let's look at the mathematics of evergreening. If you force banks to offer a struggling household a 6-month interest-only breathing space without conducting any fresh affordability checks, you aren't actually solving the insolvency.
You're just kicking the can down the road.
Exactly. If a household's real wages have been decimated by sustained 4% inflation, their underlying economics are broken. When that 6-month period ends, their capital balance hasn't reduced, meaning their future payments will actually be higher to amortize the principal over a shorter remaining term.
It's a compounding issue.
Are we just masking inevitable defaults under the banner of consumer support?
We are certainly delaying them, and that is precisely where standard mechanical economic models are failing right now. Hugh Hill made a fascinating observation about this in his speech.
Oh, the bit about the science fiction writers.
Yes. He noted that institutions like the CIA and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security actually employ science fiction writers to combat institutional groupthink and develop out-of-the-box scenario planning.
The Bank of England advocating for science fiction writers to fix probability models. You couldn't make it up.
It sounds absurd on the surface, but the underlying logic is profound. Traditional probability of default and loss. Given default models rely on historical correlations between interest rates, employment, and arrears.
But those models cannot predict how overlapping shocks like sticky inflation, outstripping wage growth while energy prices spike will impact household liquidity.
Exactly. Banks need creative, nonlinear thinking right now because the historical data is no longer a reliable predictor of future defaults.
So next week, your commercial teams need to design highly visible, proactive outreach campaigns targeted specifically at that cohort of 1.6 million customers. You have to find them and engage them before the distress signals appear on their credit files.
And your risk modeling teams need to fundamentally recalibrate their PD and LGD models. They cannot assume that the mortgage charter fixes the underlying math.
The models must capture the genuine compounding sensitivity of these vulnerable cohorts to a sustained 4% inflation environment.
Throughout this deep dive, we have examined how the regulator rigorously assesses your firm's culture, your integrity, and the outcomes you deliver for your clients. But we really need to turn the mirror inward and look at how banks are assessing the culture of their own people.
Oh, this is arguably one of the most alarming cultural regressions we have seen this year. As reported by The Times, major banks are ramping up biometric workplace surveillance to an astonishing degree.
It's quite dystopian.
It really is. HSBC is rolling out an internal global security strategy, spending $15 million in London alone. They are installing nearly 1,750 cameras and almost 800 biometric readers, including full hand scanners, just to monitor staff moving around the office.
And JP Morgan is piloting keystroke tracking and video call surveillance, framing it under the bizarre guise of employee well-being.
Well-being. Seriously.
Yeah.
It points to a deeply toxic, heavily process-driven compliance culture. The fundamental issue here is that when an institution starts measuring the physical busyness of its staff, how many keys they press or how long they sit at a desk, rather than evaluating their actual output, it totally fractures morale.
It does. And think about the regulatory context. The FCA and the PRA are aggressively demanding a culture of trust, psychological safety, and candor. But if you treat your professionals like battery hens, constantly surveilled for every mouse click, you destroy that psychological safety.
Let me be blunt. If you require a biometric hand scanner and keystroke logging to ensure your highly paid professionals are actually working, you haven't hired a bank, you've built a high-security prison.
It is a staggering contradiction in governance.
It really is.
Yeah.
On one hand, the FCA is moving towards outcome-based regulation, like we just discussed with CP 2610, shifting from necessary to sufficient information, trusting professional judgment. Yet internally, banks are regressing to extreme, micromanaged process monitoring of their own staff.
Because it is a failure of management masquerading as security. And from a risk perspective, it creates a massive chilling effect. An employee who feels constantly monitored and distrusted is significantly less likely to raise their hand and flag a genuine regulatory or conduct risk.
It creates a culture of fear that directly undermines the exact integrity the regulator is demanding.
Which means next week, you need to seriously review your internal performance metrics. Ask yourself, are you measuring genuine output, client outcomes, and deal flow? Or have you fallen into the trap of measuring physical presence and keystrokes?
Furthermore, you need to audit your internal HR technology. You must ensure that this bossware isn't creating a culture of fear that actively stops your employees from raising the compliance red flags that the PRA and FCA expect them to report.
Okay, let's synthesize the critical threads from this week. First, integrity is no longer a soft metric. It is a strictly enforced fundamental rule with personal liability implications. Ensure your board-level reporting data is completely bulletproof so you do not end up like the Bank of London.
Second, do not blindly trust an Annex 1 counterparty registration. As the MFS collapse demonstrates, your due diligence on wholesale funding must interrogate the actual collateral and lending standards, not just the AML checks.
Third, embraced the CP 2610 advice rules to innovate and offer streamlined services, but carefully and legally define your boundaries for what constitutes sufficient information to protect against future hindsight judgments.
And finally, prepare your operations for proactive mortgage charter outreach, because sticky inflation is breaking traditional affordability models.
And you must keep your eyes on the horizon. The regulatory perimeter is set to tighten aggressively over the next 12 months. We have the new critical third parties regime coming into force for tech providers, and buy now, pay later products are finally coming under FCA oversight this July.
Big change is coming.
Definitely. I will leave you with this final thought to mull over. We know the FCA's 2026 work program is heavily invested in using generative AI to speed up authorizations and triage market intelligence. How long until they deploy that exact same AI capability to actively scrape and evaluate your firm's layered digital advice journeys in real time?
That is a terrifying thought.
The era of submitting a static, carefully curated regulatory return is coming to an end. Is your underlying data infrastructure genuinely ready for a regulator that never sleeps?
That's all from us this week. Thanks for listening to RegTalkUK. Until next time, stay sharp, stay informed, and stay compliant.
It trying to practice like in paint, my crap, and back and never.